Hello guys, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Mountaineering podcast. Now this podcast is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming mountaineering adventure. Once a week, I'm going to be sharing with you in-depth and evidence-backed information around improving your physical performance on the mountain, reducing your likelihood of pain and injury, nutrition for mountaineers, and even a bit of mental strength development, so you can be empowered in your training to give yourself the very best chance of a safe, enjoyable, and successful mountaineering adventure. So now that you know what you're in for, let's get into today's episode. Alright, hello guys. Today we are talking all about how you can train for mountaineering without any mountains to train on. Now this is probably one of the most common questions I hear from aspiring mountaineers, and one of the most common things that I get in my inbox every single week from mountaineers who live in somewhere which is absolutely flat as a pancake, and they say, look Rowan, I've got this big mountain over in Nepal, or I've got this big mountain coming up over in South America or something like that, but where I live is absolutely zero elevation. Now, what can I do to get my body ready to just go uphill all day? And I wouldn't be surprised if half the listeners in this podcast are probably in the same situation, because not all of us are blessed to live near the mountains. And unfortunately, a lot of the training advice coming around in the mountaineering community from some of the sort of top performing mountaineers and the usual advice or sources of advice around there are coming from people who simply live near mountains. Maybe they've grown up there, or maybe they've made the choice to move out there because that's their passion and they have that option. But unfortunately, a lot of us aren't in that situation. So what can you do here? Well, luckily enough, that you can get ready for some of the biggest mountains in the world, even if you don't have any elevation to train on. You just have to train smart, and you have to be very, very specific about the choices you make in your week. And today I'm going to be talking you through a four-step process which I take my clients through when they're in this situation, which can get them fit and strong for some of the biggest mountains without them having to have any mountains to train on. So the first thing that you really want to think about, and the number one priority here, is getting strong. Going to the gym, lifting heavy resistance, and getting strong. Now, if you are training for a big mountain and you are not training maximal strength, you are mental. I cannot stress that enough. If you are only training high repetition training, in which you do lots and lots of work and get a good burn on the muscles, but you're not training heavier stuff to really work that max strength, you are mental. Now, that's just if you're training for a mountaineering expedition. If you are not training max strength and you don't have any elevation to train on in your local area, you are beyond mental, and it is just so crazy if you're not doing that. And this can be one of the most important and the most beneficial areas of training, which can prepare you for big days on the mountain when you don't have a chance to actually train on mountains in your local area. Now, there's two real big reasons behind this. Number one is strength reserve, which is something that's pretty well described by Uphill Athlete in their books, and it's something we previously touched on in another podcast. But very briefly, if you haven't heard it before, here's a really simple example. If you say you were going to climb up a mountain in Nepal, say you're going to go climb Manaslu or whatever you're going to do, and every single step you took on day one, you're going up a relatively steep incline, every single step you took was a bit of a struggle. It wasn't a maximal struggle, you weren't really hating life, but it was, say, taking maybe a 5 out of 10 effort for every single step that you take. Now, obviously, if you're doing a 5 out of 10 effort for every single step you take, you're going to get tired really quickly, and more than likely, you're not going to get through an entire expedition. Alternatively, if you did that, you failed, you had a really bad time, you went home, you trained max strength for 12 weeks and then flew back over, did exactly the same thing, and this time, seeing your legs are so much stronger, every single step that you take takes a 2 out of 10 effort, obviously you're going to fatigue much slower, obviously you're going to be a lot more comfortable, and obviously you're going to be able to get up that mountain much quicker and have a much bigger chance of success. And that's basically what strength reserve is, and that's probably the number one thing you want to be thinking about when getting strong. If you're not working on that max strength, every single step you're going to take is going to be harder than really is strictly necessary, and you're really, really making it harder than you need to be. So that's number one, strength reserve, very, very important. Number two, which often gets overlooked, but it is very, very important as well, is max strength. And the more max strength you have, very much improves your muscular endurance work. Now, mountaineers are pretty familiar with muscular endurance work, so that's your high repetition stuff, whether you're in the gym, it's your loaded hill intervals, it's your stair intervals, all of that stuff, which we're going to go into a minute. But if you're going straight into that type of training and you don't have a good base of max strength behind you, there's going to be a very, very there's going to be a limit to how much you can improve in this type of training. However, the stronger you get, that limit keeps on getting higher and higher and higher. So you're basically raising the roof on your potential for performance. It's sort of the same thing with your aerobic capacity training and your higher intensity training. If you don't have that aerobic foundation as a base, is really going to limit your performance as you get into your higher intensity training. And it's the exact same stuff when it comes to the relationship between maximal strength and muscular endurance. So you very much want to be working on maximal strength. So the next question I often get from this is, what exercises should I be thinking about and where should I be putting my focus in? Well, in this situation, when you are training for elevation, whether or not you have mountains at all, goes for all mountaineers, the number one exercise you want to be striving for and want to be putting a lot of focus into is a low box barbell step up, which basically involves you finding a box which is only about halfway up your shin, putting a heavy barbell on your back, and then going up and down a certain number of times. Now, the beauty of this particular exercise is it is the single most specific way you can overload your muscles for elevation. Now, when you're going, when you're mountaineering, you aren't taking huge, outrageously big steps unless you're doing some really technical rock scrambling or whatever it may be, but the majority of your climbing are going to be relatively small steps. When you're doing loaded hill intervals, you're going to simulate that, obviously, but you're not going to be absolutely outrageously overloading the muscles. In this way, when you have a barbell on your back with a low box in the gym, you can put huge amount of weight through that particular movement, really, really overload it, really get incredibly specifically strong, and that transfers directly into your performance on the mountain. And it's the single most specific thing you can do to help your muscles going up elevation. The beauty of this exercise as well is it's really, really simple to do. So if you don't have a big background in strength training and you're not 100% confident around doing heavy squats or heavy deadlifts, most people can learn how to do heavy step-ups pretty quickly. It really requires relatively minimal coordination or concentration. So again, if you don't have a huge background or you're not 100% confident with heavier strength training, you can get your head around this pretty quickly. It is pretty back friendly when it comes down to maximum strength training. Obviously, anything with a barbell on your back, you've got to be confident, but if you do have recurring lower back issues which can get flared up by heavy squats or heavy deadlifts, this is a really great option, and it's very easy to load up. So again, seeing it's so simple, you can just load a lot of weight on this and really overload those muscles. And seeing the barbells on your back, you don't really have to think about too much else. Saying that, if you're not confident with a barbell on your back or you don't like going to the gym, you want to train at home, you can do this with dumbbells or a heavy pack. I personally like the barbell because you just put it on your back, you brace your core, get yourself set, and you don't really have to think. You just basically putting all your concentration into those legs moving the weight. And I think it's the simplest form possible. But either way, whatever way you do it, a heavy low box step up is absolutely essential. Now, around all this, it's obviously not just doing this one particular exercise. You want to be following a standard strength training program for mountaineers with things like squat variations, deadlift variations, hip thrusts, lunge variations, single leg deadlifts, as well as all your upper body work. But basically the intention behind all these other lower body exercises is they're not so much to get you strong specifically for the mountain. Now, the transfer between those exercises and the mountain, there will be some, but it won't be quite as good as that step up. But the intention behind all these exercises is to get you better and stronger so you can perform better at those low box step ups, which will then directly transfer onto the mountain. So basically you're doing your training to get better at step ups, and the step ups get you better on the mountain. And that's, in a nutshell, what sport specific strength training is all about. And that's something we'll probably go into a little bit more detail in another podcast, because it is a topic in itself and it's something that's very, very misunderstood. But basically what you want to think: heavy low box step up plus all your other strength training, and make sure that's all included. So over time, how you want to plan this out, you can get really, really complicated with this, but to keep things simple today, I just want to take you through a very, very simple progression. with really what you're thinking of is starting off with moderate weight, so you'll learn all the exercises, progressively get heavier to add more stimulus and more challenge and improve that maximal strength. And then at the period where you switch over to your muscular endurance work, whether it's your last 4, 6, 8, even 10 weeks of preparation, depending on how long your program is, you just want to make sure that you keep up some maintenance of this particular strength exercise. So you don't just shift into your high repetition work, but you still do a little bit of max strength work. So for an example of this, if you're struggling to get your head around that, as a 16-week little progression plan, you could do the first 4 weeks at 8 repetitions of all your exercises, the next 4 weeks of 6 repetitions of all your exercises, the next 4 weeks of 4 repetitions of all your exercises, and then the next 4 weeks you would do 3 repetitions of your heavy low box step-ups, and then 15 or 20 repetitions of all your other exercises. Now, that's a really, really simple progression plan. That's probably just about as simple as it gets, but it is pretty effective, and if you're leading into a big adventure, that can very much work. But to wrap things up there, bit of information, might be struggling to get your head around, but max strength training is absolutely essential if you're training for elevation and you don't have any mountains. Low box step up is amazing, and then making sure you're filling out with a standard strength training program for mountaineers around that. So that's number one. Number two is we want to be thinking of muscular endurance training, which we talked about the other week in pretty much detail, so we won't go too deep into this today. But basically, muscular endurance training is one of the most important things for mountaineering. If you don't have any mountains available, it might be a little bit trickier to do as compared to other people who might just whack on a heavy pack and just go up a big old mountain and just train themselves in that way. So you do have to put a little bit more thought around it, but it is very, very important. A few easy examples here that you might think about is you might not have a mountain available, but depending where you live, you might have a hill where it will range from anywhere from 1 minute to maybe a 5 or 10 minute climb if you're lucky enough, and you could do hill intervals on there where you load up a heavy pack, go up the hill, return to the bottom, and just repeat to build up your elevation target. Some people are lucky enough to have that. Some people are in such a flat place that they just can't find that, which is fair enough. Another situation here is you might do stairs, which most mountaineers are pretty familiar with, in which you find an outdoor set of stairs, maybe an apartment block, an office tower, a stadium, go up and down the stairs. Pretty effective. Again, if you have those options, that's great. If not, can get a little bit trickier. Another option is going into the gym and doing work on, say, a stepper machine, a Jacob's ladder, a super, super steep treadmill, or even a VersaClimber. A lot of people argue that the steppers might not be so specific, or they might not replicate the mountain so well. Apparently, I don't really understand the science, but apparently they're pretty similar to going up a mountain. Obviously, you're not training the way down, but it can be relatively effective, and you just load that up with a pack and then go and go and go. If you don't have access to all of those things, you might look at a bit of sled work, so outdoors on a local oval, or some other flat surface in which you're pulling a sled. If you can't buy one of those, you can always make one of your own, and they can be pretty effective. And then the final option is just doing all high rep strength training, which we were talking about before. So if you don't have access to any of those things, you might purely just do all your training in the gym and just do lots and lots of repetitions of certain exercises. There's a whole bunch of different options there, and if you do struggle for elevation, there is always an option for you. You just have to think about it a little bit more carefully, and you want to weigh up the fact of convenience versus practicality. So if you do have, maybe you can find a 5-minute hill, but that's 45-minute drive away, it might not be worth doing that if you can spend that hour and a half driving on your training somewhere else. So you got to weigh that up. Now, if you do want a few more ideas around this, around muscular endurance training for mountaineering, you want to get in a little bit more detail around those things I mentioned in some specific workouts or some specific templates that you can use. If you haven't downloaded already, I do have the Mountaineers Muscular Endurance Handbook, which is free to download off my website, in which it takes you through 7 specific workouts of muscular endurance training for mountaineering. You can find that at my website at summitstrength.com.au/mountaineer-handbook, and I'll leave a link for that in the show notes below. But if you were wondering about your muscular endurance training, do get involved with that, because it's got some great workouts. So now we've talked about your strength training, we talked about your max strength training and your muscular endurance training. Now we want to go shift onto the other side of the spectrum and talk about your conditioning and your cardio training. because obviously this very much plays into it. Now, the first most important thing you want to be thinking about, again, is aerobic capacity training, as is the most important thing for every single mountaineer out there. We all know it's important. Every single mountaineer should be doing this anyway, whether or not you have mountains or not to train on. This involves hiking, running, cycling, whatever you might be doing, just doing long periods of that at low intensity and gradually building up distance and time. It doesn't really matter in this situation if you don't have any elevation to train on. So if you're hiking and you don't have any trails that have elevation, you're just hiking on the flat, or if you're running on the flat or you cycle on the flat, it doesn't really matter here so much. It's not ideal, but it doesn't matter. So you don't need to go chasing muscle burn with these workouts, whether it might be, I know some people ride their bikes with heavy resistance, they might load up their packs to an outrageous weight or whatever they may do. In this situation, when you're doing your aerobic capacity training, you don't really need to worry about that. Instead, you're chasing duration and you're chasing time. So you want to be thinking, I just want to go for long periods of time. I want to develop that aerobic capacity. I want to develop those cardiovascular adaptations, and I'm going to develop my muscles and my endurance in other ways. So put endurance out of your mind with these workouts. The ultimate aim with this, when you are training for elevation, is basically you want to be moving for longer periods of time than your biggest day on the mountain. So if you were in the situation where you're training for, a day where an expedition where you're doing, let's say 10-hour days on average, and you had mountains to train on, you might simply be running or hiking for 10 hours a day, 10 hours in your aerobic capacity sessions, and you might be building up for that. In the situation where you don't have elevation to train on, you might, in that situation, be trying to lead up to 14-hour training days or 16-hour training days or something like that. Because while you won't get that added challenge of elevation during your training, you can sort of overload it through duration. You want to have a think about here, and probably try to get a little bit longer than your biggest day on the mountain. Obviously, if you're doing a 24-hour summit day, that gets a little bit more complicated. But as an average day, you want to be making sure you're comfortable moving for long periods of time and longer than your average days. So aerobic capacity training, very much important. We don't probably need to go into too much more detail there. Then the final thing I want to talk about, the fourth step with all of this, or the fourth facet of all of this, is thinking about longer interval training. So in this situation, when you're training for elevation, aerobic capacity is not enough. Sure, it is the most important thing you need to be doing, and it's 100% so essential. And if you're going to choose one thing to concentrate on, that should be it. But to make things in the best situation, you also want to ensure that the body can work and not only sustain that aerobic energy system, but can also work at the top levels of that aerobic energy system pretty comfortably. And you want to be able to make sure that you can be working in your aerobic energy system when you're working a little bit higher intensity. So if you are getting to difficult sections on the climb, if you are getting a little bit huffed and puffed, if you are going through a bit of a challenging situation, you are still working aerobically as opposed to shifting into a bit more anaerobic work. So challenging that top level of the aerobic energy system is pretty effective here. And you also want to challenge the cardiovascular system with a bit of high intensity just to create different adaptations, which are going to help you, which we won't go too much into detail, but that is very important. So there are many ways to go about this, and higher intensity training as a whole is pretty misunderstood. Many people make the mistake of just doing random hit sessions. So they'll just do 30-second sprints, and one day 45-second sprints, and then they'll do a CrossFit workout, and then they'll do this and that. And that's not a really good way of going about this, and it's not very effective. The same thing with just doing random intervals of, say, look, all right, today I'm going to do in 30-30s, and then I might do Tabata, and then I might do a minute sprints, and just randomly going between numbers. That can help, but it's definitely not very smart. And if you put a little bit more structure behind it, a little bit more thought behind it, you definitely can get a lot more out of this type of training. When we're training to elevation without any mountains, I personally like something that's called aerobic power intervals, which are very specific intervals which train the top level that your body can sustain exercise while still using the aerobic energy system or using oxygen as a fuel source. So this is very specific prescription, but it's very effective, and I've used this with pretty much every single one of my clients who are training for mountain expeditions. So basically in this situation, you want to choose a type of exercise in which you can go quick and you can go hard, but doesn't doesn't have the limiting factor of your legs burning out and your legs getting tired, but instead you're challenging your breathing. So you're trying to get huffed and puffed instead of your legs. So we're not doing steep inclines if you're running or anything like that, but we're choosing something where you can challenge that breathing as opposed to the legs. So this might involve a few examples here. If you were an experienced runner, so you are quite happy running all day, you're quite happy sprinting, you might do sprints around the track on a flat track and really, really go hard out there. If you're just an intermediate runner, so you do a bit of running, but you're not so experienced with sprinting or anything, you might do some slight incline running, so on a very, very small incline, and just find a period where you can run up and down a hill. The reason behind this is when we're sprinting on the flat or going very, very quick on the flat, the hamstrings do a lot of work, and if you're not ready for it, you are a very, very significant risk of a hamstring strain. But putting a very, very slight incline into your running, that really, really limits this and minimizes this. So depending on your experience, you choose either a flat track or a slight incline. However, if you're not a runner, you don't have to do this running. You can do it on a stationary cycle, which I absolutely love because you can change resistance and just smash it out. You can do it on a rowing erg, you can do it on a salt bike, you could even do it on a stepper if you didn't find your legs were burning out, or any other type of cardio machine which you can really, really put some pretty solid input into. So once you've chosen what you want to do, the prescription goes, and this is very, very specific timings and very, very specific prescription. So listen up here. The intervals are going to be between 2.5 minutes to 3.5 minutes long. So that's going to be your working intervals. Your resting intervals, in which you're going complete rest or very, very slow, are going to be half of your working interval to the same as your working interval. So 0.5 to 1 ratio towards your working interval. So for example, a half of 2.5 minutes would be 1.25 minute, whatever that works out to be, up to 2.5 minutes. So you figure that out. So 0.5 to 1. You're going to repeat the intervals 5 to 8 times, and then you're going to do 1 to 3 sets. So what I mean by that is you might do 8 intervals of 2.5 minutes at a time. You might have a 2-3 minute rest, and then do another set of exactly the same thing. And you can work that out. You don't have to do 3 sets, but depending on your training time and your experience and what you need. So what this could look like in action as a progression plan, as with everything, you want to be progressing over time. You want to make it a little bit harder. In the first 4 weeks, you might do 2.5 minutes on, 90-second rest, and choose how many sets and reps you want to do. Next 4 weeks, you do 3 minutes on, 90 seconds rest. Next 4 weeks, 3.5 minutes on, and then 2-minute rest. Now that's a really, really simple progression plan. It keeps you within those prescriptions very well, but that's really, really effective at working that top level of the aerobic energy system, and very, very specific for this situation where you're training for elevation, and it's going to prepare you for those tougher sections on the trail. And I find that very, very, very effective. So a little bit complex there, and probably might have to listen to that a few times to get your head around it, but it is a very, very effective training progression and very, very effective training prescription in this particular situation. So, to wrap things up, if you are training for mountaineering and you live in the flattest place on earth, do not worry, you just have to be smart with your training. Make sure you get strong, work on maximal strength training in your preparations. Make sure you do a lot of muscular endurance training in whatever way, shape or form that you can. Make sure you go hard out on your aerobic capacity training, making sure your duration is really, really getting quite long there. And then finally, have a go at those aerobic power intervals or those longer intervals and work yourself through a progression there. Now, put those 4 things together in amongst all your other little bits and pieces, like your prehab, like your core training, like your mobility training, like your recovery work, and all of that jazz, and you have a very, very nice program to prepare you for some of the biggest mountains in the world, even if you don't have anywhere to train on that has the slightest elevation. So a little bit more technical today, guys. I hope it all sunk in. I hope it all was relatively clear. Sometimes it is a little bit tricky to display this information over audio, but hopefully it all hit the mark. If anyone does have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me. And as I said, if you did want to get your hands on that muscular endurance handbook for mountaineers, you can go to summitstrength.com.au/mountaineer-handbook. That'll give you 7 amazing workouts to develop your muscular endurance for mountaineering, and we'll go into a little bit more detail around some of the options I mentioned today. So thank you so much for listening. I really do hope you got a little bit of value out of this episode, and we'll talk to you very soon. Bye.